So, Dame Priti Patel, what a week we've had in politics, and we're going to talk about it. Now, look, it's the autumn statement, and you wrote before the autumn statement that you wanted a pro-growth, tax-cutting autumn statement from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. Did he deliver it for you?
I'll tell you how I feel about the autumn statement. My sense is with the Chancellor, he's just sort of nudged the door open a little bit in terms of laying forward that sort of foundational pathway to lower business taxes in particular. And I think business taxes, lowering them, are really important, because all of that does lead to a pro-growth economy. It leads to more investment in our country and in skills and in the labour market and everything else. I feel that he's just set the direction of travel. We're not there yet. We're nowhere near there yet. And we can talk about some of the measures. But I genuinely think, you know, this is really the last chance to start signalling that intent, laying those key foundations, and really demonstrating that the Conservative Party in government is a party that is on the side of business.
But, so you think it was a Conservative sort of themed autumn statement, but let me just pick up on a couple of points. I mean, first of all, taxes are higher than they've ever been in our history.
They are, yeah,
we
we
always
know,
talk about being a low tax party, but we're the government of the highest taxes on record. So, have we already gone too far raising taxes, or is this a genuine sort of Conservative way forward?
So, you may not have seen the OBR and some of the forecasts. I think it's pretty self-evident that the tax burden is appallingly high. Yeah. We have seen a Conservative government, and I think I wrote this week as well, high inflation, highest rates of taxation in 70 years. The Institute of Fiscal Studies have quantified this, and it's jaw-dropping stuff. Now, the government can make the case as to why that is. COVID, for example, naturally. External factors, Ukraine, Russia war, the implications of all of that, energy prices, you name it, you go on and on and on.
A lot of the tax rises predate that. So you've signed this thing called the UK Tax Pledge,
That's
which
right,
is a pledge that you won't vote to increase taxes. In fact, I've signed it as well. Yeah. But a lot of the tax rises predate COVID. And in fact, we were already on a trajectory of taxes going up well before
So you know why? So you have to, look.
Is Boris Johnson's plan?
We could sit down and do a matrix of the taxes that have gone up. And actually, I think, there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, I've just come from Parliament and I've spoken in Parliament and basically said I want to see more transparency. I believe in following money, people, outcomes. I think for every pound the state spends, there should be greater transparency. But you've asked a question about when did taxes go up. Well, corporation tax went up, under the Boris Johnson government. Look at the whole issue, and I speak about this a lot, freezing tax allowances, which leads to fiscal drag, which drags more people into higher rates of tax bands. I thought we should have seen those shifted, and I would like to see that, and I will continue to lobby the government on all of that. Now, I'm an ex-Treasury Minister, and we can all make the case as to why it was important to freeze them at a certain time. They could be inflationary with everything else that's going on. You have to look at the dynamic interaction within the economy. However, that was then. We are where we are now. And the most important thing about the direction of travel is that it is right that Jeremy Hunt starts signalling the way forward on lower taxes, both for personal taxation, I do want to speak about that in a minute, but also business taxation. I actually think there's a lot more that can be done on both, and I've said some of that in Parliament today. And it's inevitable. The Chancellor has views as to how he can do that. We all have our own views too. We have to hit the right spot so that we have sustained economic growth. And importantly, the public, and it is about the public, feel that they have, not just feel that they have it, but they actually have more money in their pockets and that they're keeping more of the money that they earn.
So look, two things. On business taxes, the Chancellor said today, this week in the autumn statement, that it's the biggest business tax cut on record by introducing this thing called full expensing. But in fact, that doesn't even compensate for the increase in corporation tax.
That's right.
Now, are they being straightforward with the public, or are they sort of conning your background's business? Are they conning business?
I'm never going to get into the debate about language around are they being honest and conning and all this kind of stuff. I'm on the record on my views on corporation tax. I think it should have been lowered. And I'm going to give you the classic example of what happens when you reduce corporation tax. We joined Parliament at the same time. 2010 to 15, that Parliament was quite tough, actually. Terrible economic backdrop, financial crisis. But guess what? A Conservative, actually it was coalition government, did at the time, lowered corporation tax. And by 2015, business investment in the UK had gone up by nearly 32%. It was actually 31.9%. And that is a classic example of how you can actually do the signalling to the world internationally, to businesses of all shapes and sizes, of what happens when you create the right kind of business taxation in your jurisdiction. And I'm a believer in that. And as you all know, because I think you may have joined me in this debate during the, before the summer actually, after the budget, the minimum rate of corporation tax, which is this OECD project that Rishi Sunak has signed us up to. He signed the country up to that during the pandemic, and I don't think there's been much transparency around that. That is effectively giving away our tax sovereignty and letting the OECD set the rate of minimum level of corporation tax, which we will not effectively be in charge of ourselves. That's only one aspect to it, but quite frankly, the government should absolutely run ahead and slash corporation tax, because that's the biggest example of actually putting rocket fuel in the tanks of business and saying we are open to the world and making us competitive going forward. And then the whole issue about full expensing, because we have discussed this in Parliament quite extensively, is I think it just will create a new army of regulation, more tax accountants and, you know, lawyers that businesses have to hire, and that defeats the object, you know, quite frankly. Why do we need to get into that regulatory space all over again? Because they still have to interact with HMRC to get the full benefits of full expensing. So I would much rather see a simpler tax system, one that is much more transparent. And we've heard today about the abolition of national insurance, class 2. National insurance for people that are self-employed. I just think, you know, that's a good thing, but actually you could have merged income tax and national insurance and made it much more clinical.
And can the Conservatives win the election without cutting taxes further?
I'm not sure, and I say this because we have to go back to what we stand for philosophically, which at the end of the day is being on the side of hardworking people, speaking about aspiration, economic security for families and for people that go out to work. And I would much rather see a coherent set of policies and a narrative around that. Now, you know, to be honest, those that are running the Conservative Party right now will make the calls and make the decisions on that. But I genuinely
But are they
believe,
making the right call on tax?
So I don't think they are. I think there's more. I think there's more to do, and I'm saying that here. I've said that publicly in the House of Commons as well. I think there is more to do, and I do think we have to be consistent and coherent in making that case for reform. And by the way, Jake, linked to this, you know, everyone will say, and I think Rishi Sunak may have said this, tax cuts cannot be unfunded. We'll have a better programme basically to deal with government spending and the expenditure of the state.
Moving on from tax, you introduced the points-based immigration system as per the manifesto that both you and I stood on. We've seen new immigration figures this week. I mean, they're eye-wateringly large. How have we got to the point where the government seems to have lost control of immigration?
So it's really important to differentiate between the legal system, and rightly you've mentioned the points-based immigration system, and I do want to talk about this. And then you've got the illegal issue, which is obviously very contentious, but I don't think the government has handled that particularly well. On the points-based system, there are very, very clear parameters as to how people come to our country, because on points-based system, they come here to work. So they have to be sponsored. So it's all through employer-led schemes. And also, they're net contributors to the exchequer. So, you know, we can't just assume that people are coming here and there's lots of free riding taking place. They have to pay the immigration health surcharge, which is in the thousands of pounds, not just for them, but for their family members. And also their visas are incredibly expensive too, and they're coming to contribute.
Based on that system, is there a sort of Is there a ceiling on it? Are you relaxed for that to go as high as anyone anyone can go?
So Jake, when I left the department last year, which I left government, out of on my own terms, basically, I resigned from government because, quite frankly, of the appalling antics that took place in Westminster with a lot of our colleagues. We actually put in measures and we handed over to my then successor, what I used to call the automatic stabilisers, which is a bit of a Treasury term. Those are the levers that the Home Secretary had to basically reduce the number of people coming into the country. So increases with the Migration Advisory Committee on salary thresholds, for example, which is really important. You know, that has to keep on increasing. And we saw this previously, that if you don't do that, you just have people coming in to do jobs which, quite frankly, could be done by British people in the UK, but they also have to be skilled and trained. The other factor, and I'm very vocal about this, and I was when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, and I'm very disappointed there's been no movement on this. I believe we need a UK-wide labour market strategy, because by having a points-based system, you cannot just rely on migrant workers coming in, despite the majority of this being quite, pretty high skilled at the higher end threshold, so they are net contributors.
Moving on to illegal migration. Look, Suella Braverman's resignation letter was an absolute corker. There is a prize. You may have won it actually for Resignation of the Year here in Parliament. That should win Resignation Letter of the Century. And one thing she pointed out in that letter about her concerns about the Rwanda plan was the failure of the government to incorporate ways of getting around the Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the British Human Rights Act. Do you think the government should have taken a more robust approach when they were bringing forward the Illegal Migration Act to ensure that we could get the Rwanda plan off the ground?
So I don't think it's as straightforward and simple as that. And everyone has a view, I remember being lectured by people saying, you need to do this when you were Home Secretary on illegal migration. People behaved as if I sat and did nothing. We did pushback and turnbacks, and quite frankly, even the Royal Navy did not want to participate in pushback and turnbacks. And then there were issues such as SOLAS, International Treaty, Saving Lives at Sea. You specifically asked about ECHR and the domestic implications of that. Well, Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, actually set up an illegal migration task force where government law officers were asked to look at that particular aspect, the deviations, the derogations of certain aspects of ECHR, and the advice that came back from ministers who led the government law officers at the time was that that was too difficult and not possible to do.
So do we have to leave the ECHR in terms... Look, we need to have a sovereign immigration policy. We need to protect it. Do we have to leave the ECHR to do that?
To do what? To implement Rwanda?
Well, to implement Rwanda and stop
so
the
not
boats.
To implement Rwanda, no, because if you listen to the Supreme Court judge hearing the judgment and the Court of Appeal judgment, the Supreme Court was explicit that their decision was not based on any aspect of ECHR. They were explicit about that. What they did say, and I think this is really interesting, and I think the government is going to come under pressure on this. I will be interacting with the new Home Secretary, and I have had conversations already, is the whole issue of refoulement, where effectively when you send migrants to asylum seekers to a third country to process their claims, which is the principle of Rwanda, that effectively that they should not be sent back to the country that they left or to another country where they could be subject to, quite frankly, degrading conditions and human rights violations. Now, I'm afraid that is not new news. When I entered the partnership with Rwanda, we put a lot of money actually into Rwanda directly as part of that agreement to build capacity around asylum case processing, to do all the assurances around legal processes, to bring all the accommodation facilities forward, and importantly, raise the bar on resettlement so that people rebuild their lives. So, Jake, to your point, that has nothing to do with ECHR, and the questions now are what on earth was going on in government over the last 12 months, because they were on the hook on this, and they had plenty of notice on this point of refoulement when the Court of Appeal basically ruled against the government.
Okay, so look, over 100 million quid, I think, has gone into Rwanda.
Yes.
Are we going to see flights leave with all of the challenges the government has?
Well,
are we going to see flights leave
I can't answer that because quite frankly,
before the general election?
Well, I want them to, and I will be very candid. I am very annoyed by that Supreme Court ruling, and I'll tell you for why. Because I absolutely, having set up that scheme, some commentators had the audacity to say, oh, we just rushed into it and didn't do any work. That is complete nonsense. I went to the UN, the United Nations. I sat down with the head of UNHCR, with the Rwandan foreign minister to have the discussions. And it was the UNHCR evidence that went to the Supreme Court that basically went against the government. So the government actually has to roll its sleeves sleeves up
Do the
right
work.
now and do the hard graft. And there is hard graft.
Have they
And
not
I think
put that in?
and I think that's really disappointing that actually that was not even recognised. We don't know the work that's taken place over the last 12 months. And I think there should be questions as to what work happened.
Italy has signed an agreement with Albania, which will
Yes,
see
yeah.
up to 32,000 people a year sent to Albania. Is it time that the government thought of a plan B, thought of a different country? Would you be just as happy to see people sent to the third country if that was Albania?
So look, the government has lots of options and choices. I mean, to be quite frank, Jake, when we did the Rwanda scheme, we had multiple dialogues with other countries as well. We were already in discussions with Albania, not for resettlement, not
But
directly.
should that be where the government goes next? I mean,
I don't know.
isn't it a sad day when we're saying if only we were as good
I
as the
don't
government
know.
as Italy?
I disagree with that. I completely disagree with that. I really
Right.
do. On the basis that we have the Rwanda scheme and it's in everybody's interest to make that scheme work.
Okay, so it's Rwanda or bust.
I think the scheme is deliverable. I really do.
Before
but
the-
the government
before the
has to
general
do
election.
the work. We can sit here and discuss the pros and cons. Neither of us are there. We need to see. The government is on the hook now. The government needs to roll its sleeves up and make that plan deliverable. I had an army of officials in the Home Office that were working day in, day out on the
deliver it.
deliverability of that scheme. So questions have to be asked. What has gone wrong? And they need to fix it.
Okay, so do you think that Suella Braverman was right to describe these marches we've seen in central London as hate marches?
Look, I'm not Jake. I'm not going to get into her descriptions as to those marches. You know, the job of the Home Secretary, having been there for over 3 years, it's incredibly tough and it's difficult. And there is a balance, and I do believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression. There is a balance to people going out on the streets and protesting, but doing it within the rule of law and respecting actually the values of our own country. And, you know, I've got very strong views myself on the protests, on why people were coming out. But at the same time, we're in a very difficult and precarious situation when you look at what's going on in the Middle East and how people have been expressing themselves. And quite frankly, what I think is not right is when we sort of give a running commentary and criticise the police every day. I know operationally
Would you be
what the police
critical of them
do.
allowing people to climb on war memorials?
I would, of course, and quite frankly, I have done. So I was Home Secretary when the Black Lives Matters protests took place. There was something like 65 protests that took place during the pandemic. I think it was from literally May 2020 to March 2021. And we had all sorts of protests taking place. And quite frankly, you know, the police had a very, very difficult job in, number one, policing them, making sure they did not turn into grotesque escapades of violence, and that sadly in some
is that where
cases they
these
did.
marches have gone in
And
terms of
that's where we
Palestine?
had, if you recall, the Coulson statue that was toppled over. I was about to introduce the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill into Parliament, and we saw some of the most ridiculous acts of thuggery and violence take place, which, you know, it's right that we stand up and criticise them. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, the police act within the laws. If they feel they need more powers and more laws, then those are the discussions that they need to have with the government of the day.
Okay, so the other thing I suppose we have to contemplate, if I may, I think you're sitting pretty really, aren't you? You've got a 24,082 majority in Whittam. I'm sort of getting a bit nervous with the 9,000 majority. Do you think the Labour Party is a government in waiting? Does Keir Starmer look like a serious individual to you who's ready to take the reins of power?
So look, we've been around a bit politically now, and you know we've seen different governments as well. Coalition government. I remember the Tony Blair government, and I used to work with a lot of New Labour people as well prior to coming to Westminster. I think our focus should be on us and governing the country and focusing on winning the election. There are lots of things that I dislike about Labour. There are lots of things we all dislike about Labour. There really are. And I think actually our job is to demonstrate with some conviction and confidence that we are going to win the election, can win the election, and that we're going to take the country to a better future. And the type of future that Labour cannot deliver, because they themselves are a divided party. I know sometimes our party doesn't look exactly happy and united and, you know, particularly friendly. But the reality is, you know, socialism runs deep in their party, and socialism is corrosive, and it has corrosive impacts on countries and economies and on individuals and people. And I don't want to see that in our country.
So every general election is a referendum on your personal future. That's people go out and vote Conservative because they believe that we offer the best for their future. Do you think Rishi Sunak's made a mistake by bringing David Cameron back? Is that harking back to, you know, what used to be good rather than looking to the future?
It's an interesting choice, isn't it? I mean, it's been I think it's been interesting. It's been different to watch the return of David Cameron. We were MPs when David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party, went on to become Prime Minister. And I remember those coalition days, sometimes, you know, fondly, because we got a lot done.
I don't think anyone thinks that David Cameron is a bad individual, but is it a retrograde step to sort of look back and bring him back into government rather than?
I think it's unusual in that sense. Of course it's unusual. But at the same time, I mean, I actually think we need more experience in government. I also think we've got a lot of experience on our backbenches.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the choice that Rishi Sunak has made, and you know, the public might actually, you know, have a view on that as well. It was
an eye-opening reshuffle. Suella got fired. David Cameron got brought back. You know, it certainly was one.
It was different in that sense.
It was different. So is it Rishi right to fire Suella?
Well, that's his call.
Yeah.
You know, that's absolutely the prerogative, his prerogative. He's brought James Cleverly. James Cleverly is my neighbour, by the way, in Essex as well. And, you know, I think we have to look forwards, not backwards. I really do. There could be an election next year. And at the end of the day...
There will be an election next year.
Well, at the end of the day, I think it's important that everyone in government doesn't start airbrushing, you know, the programme of delivery that we had since 2019, but they start talking it up and they start to remind the public, what they voted for in 2019, people's priorities, and actually what we have delivered.
You're very busy. Are you going to spend any time to watch Nigel Farage in the jungle? I remember at Conservative Party conference, you famously danced with Nigel Farage.
So
Are you going to watch him in the jungle?
I do know Nigel. We get on well. I haven't had time yet because it's the start of his you know, big expedition in the jungle, so to speak. I think I will watch bits of it.
So what bit? Because the big story this week was everyone saw Nigel Farage's bottom as he was getting showered. Will you scroll back to see Nigel's bottom?
I will not. I don't do all those replay type things. I really don't. So at some stage, maybe at the weekend, I will just, you know, in between all the other things that I like watching, like Grand Prix and everything else, I will give it a go.
And is he the future of the Conservative movement? Can you see Nigel Farage coming back as a Conservative?
I don't know. And I've had those conversations with Nigel as well, you know, because our politics were very political, all that kind of stuff, very Thatcherite. That's a call for him, actually, at the end of the day. It really is. You know, he may spend time in the jungle and think, you know, I've had enough of it all. Thank you very much. And you might want to take up a new career doing reality TV.
Well, he's already doing that. Can you see him as Conservative leader?
No, I can't.
No. Okay. Rishi Sunak's 5 election pledges. He's hit his inflation pledge already, which I think everyone's celebrating. He's given this fiscal headroom to do these tax cuts, as we heard from the Chancellor in his autumn statement this week. How many of those other pledges do you think he's going to hit?
So I'd like to see some concentration on the NHS, to be honest.
So do you think he'll bring waiting lists down?
We have to.
Do you think he'll stop the boats?
That's TBC.
TBC. Do you think he will reduce debt?
Well, I think you can look at the OBR forecast on that.
Grow the economy?
Where it's going. It's important we grow the economy. We need economic growth. And, you know, despite the pandemic, we have been growing, but at very, very slow rates.
So he's halved inflation. We've given 1 out of 5. Do you think he's going to hit any of those other pledges by the end of the year?
We don't know yet. I mean, come on.
He's not going to stop the boats, is he?
We don't.
Down to 0?
I think yesterday there were quite a few boat arrivals, from what I gather, and here we are, sort of mid-November.
Finally, have you read Nadine's book?
No, I haven't.
Have you seen any of the allegations in it?
I've seen some of them.
Do you think there was a plot, as Nadine says, of this channel to bring down Boris Johnson?
So, look, I remember I had a front row seat, actually, last year to everything that happened within government and around Boris. And I chose, as I said earlier on, I chose to leave government at that stage. And that was because I just didn't like the behaviours that I saw. Quite frankly, as I've touched on this already, you know, we look divided, people actually, quite frankly, scheming for jobs, lots of shenanigans going on. I don't support that at
will
all.
our
I just don't think
members
that's
ever
right.
forgive the MPs for kicking Boris out?
So I actually think the members look at the parliamentary party with just so much concern.
Yeah.
I think they literally look at us in Westminster and say, what on earth do you think you're doing? What is going on? We didn't put you in there.
Well, they didn't put Rishi there, did they?
Well, they didn't. They would also turn around and say, we didn't send you to Westminster to behave in, you know, terrible ways, upending democratically elected leaders, and just not putting head down and putting shoulder to the wheel. And I think there's a sense of disappointment across the membership.
Dame Priti Patel, thank you very much.
Thank you.